Welcome everybody to another edition of Chamber Chat, which is our opportunity during this COVID-19 response period to talk about the things that the Boulder Chamber is doing to address your needs as business leaders in our community, but also a chance to talk to some of the folks who are on the front lines of addressing these issues associated with the response and recovery efforts. Today we're glad to have Brad Feld with us. I'll introduce him in just a minute, but just so excited to have that conversation with him. But first, I want to just talk a little bit about where we are with the Boulder Chamber efforts. I will say that this is a point in time where we feel like it's maybe the end of the beginning of the circumstances around COVID-19. We've seen a sort of flattening of the curve. That is exciting. And people beginning to talk about recovery, which is obviously a bright light at the end of this tunnel. But just to talk about specifically what the Boulder Chamber is doing. Again, we focus on information, resources for you, and as I'll talk about, the beginning of recovery planning from our community standpoint. So first of all, on the information front, want you to know that we have a lunch and learn scheduled on Earth Day, April 22nd. It's called the Environmental and Operational Effects of Staying Home during the COVID-19. And we have some great speakers from the Regional Air Quality Council, from the Partners for a Clean Environment, from Namaste Solar Company, and our great partners, Boulder Transportation Connections. All of them will talk about what you, as individuals and business leaders who care about environmental sustainability, can continue to do during this at-home period to make sure that we're living out the values of environmental sustainability. Also want you to urge you to check out the Boulder Chamber website. That is the Center for Business Resource Information at boulderchamber.com/COVID-19. We have further improved that information resources to make it even easier for you to identify the information. Second, on the resource front, we know that many of you are working through the Small Business Development Center to access the SBA funding opportunities, the Paycheck Protection Program, the EIDL grants. We want to continue working with you on that, so let us know how we can support you in that effort. Look online. We have the list of all the lending institutions that are participating in those programs. Also, so you know, we are strongly advocating for that additional federal money to come through the Paycheck Protection Program so that all of you can have access to that important funding stream. In addition, you probably have heard us talk about the COVID-19 Small Business Relief Fund. That program is up and running thanks to some generous contributions that I'll talk about in a little bit. But just to be clear, that April 20 is the deadline for submitting your application. We've already received a number of applications, and we urge you to submit yours for those funding grants of up to $2,500. And the last thing I'll say in my introductory remarks, we are now starting the conversation through the Boulder Chamber in partnership with our other business support organizations, including the City of Boulder, to talk about how we're going to work through recovery in our community. And that's going to take, first of all, data. We're going to be making sure we're assessing where do we stand from our economic position in the wake of this COVID-19 crisis. We're going to talk to individual business and industry sectors to make sure we understand on the ground what are the circumstances for them. Some are not in such a bad place but could use additional support. Others are suffering significantly, and we want to help them build back their operations. And then with that information, start to build a structure for strategic support for those industry sectors and help build them up to make sure that our recovery is as quick as possible. So that's what's happening at the Boulder Chamber. But I want to be able to have a conversation now with Brad Feld. And Brad is somebody I have deep respect for. And I'm sure that many of you who know him share that with me, and you will be impressed with, I'm sure, what he has to offer today. But just as a little background, Brad has been an early stage investor in entrepreneurship and startup companies. He is an entrepreneur himself since 1987. He co-founded and now is the managing partner for the Foundry Group, which is a venture capital firm that invests in technology companies. I also will say this, and I don't say this about many folks, he is indeed a thought leader on entrepreneurship, on mental health, on life, just a very thoughtful individual. And he communicates through books, through writings, through presentations. And most relevantly, I'd say to the COVID-19 circumstance, he is now leading the private sector task force for the statewide recovery efforts, and he sits on what's called the Economic Stabilization and Growth Council, which Westward characterized as the COVID-19 Economic and Innovation Dream Team. So certainly in esteemed company he is. But I will say that anytime I talk to Brad, I always walk away just a little bit smarter. So I want to just welcome Brad, and he's going to offer just some observations regarding the impact of COVID-19 on our community, the role we can all play in protecting public health and in our recovery efforts. And then finally, just his vision, both short and long term, for the rollout of the recovery. So Brad, I welcome you and thank you for being with us today on Chamber Chat.
John, thanks for having me.
Welcome.
So one thing to just calibrate in terms of the intro, I'm not leading all of the private sector task force activity. There's a particular thing called the Innovation Response Team, which is a public sector initiative that's new. And there's a private sector complement of volunteers. There's a couple hundred of us that are very actively engaged in helping do a bunch of things as part of this innovation response team. And I think it's a particularly powerful approach to something that historically in a crisis was not a normal sort of cross-functional activity. So it's been interesting to, both spin it up, get a bunch of people involved. The volunteer activity around the state has been incredible. One of the things about a crisis like this, and I think it's true for Coloradans in general, and a lot of Americans in general, is that when there's a crisis, people want to help, they want to get involved, they want to do things to be supportive. And this has been a powerful mechanism or vehicle for a lot of people to be able to be helpful in ways that are supportive of a lot of the state-led initiatives in the crisis. I'd sort of start off with a broad comment that I think is really important to process, which is that we're not dealing with a single crisis. We're actually dealing with three crises that are happening simultaneously, and they're all interrelated. The first crisis is a health crisis. And that crisis, which really in Colorado, I think has been front of mind for roughly about 30 days, in the US started to really be something that was visibly talked about only at the beginning of March. Obviously, it's something that emerged right around the new year. But even in a business sense, like when I think about the conversations that we were having from a business perspective, even the first week of March, there wasn't sort of a sense of the magnitude of this health crisis and how it was going to impact us. So that's useful framing in terms of time. The health crisis is the thing that has triggered the economic crisis. In the absence of the health crisis, the economy in Colorado, the economy in Boulder, the economy in the US, and frankly, the global economy for most parts of the world was quite strong. When I think about it from a new business and an entrepreneurial perspective, end of January, early February, most companies had finalized their 2020 plans. And for the companies that I work with in the entrepreneurial world, I think people were extremely optimistic. Not inappropriately optimistic, but optimistic about what 2020 had to bring from a business perspective and a growth perspective for their companies. And within 30 days, that has completely been torn up and thrown away. Like whatever your 2020 plan is, just throw it away. Now, at Foundry and also through Techstars, we've got a number of companies in Seattle. So in some sense, we had a little bit, maybe 2 or 3 weeks of an instinct of that, because you could kind of see Seattle being shut down early in this cycle. But even with that, I don't think it really, the economic dynamics really clicked in. Most people probably remember it when there was all of a sudden this massive downward volatility in the stock market and a real lack of, a very disorienting dynamic. But it's important to recognize that that was caused by a health crisis. And that is a new thing for us. I'm in my mid-50s. I can't think of an economic crisis of any meaningful magnitude that was caused by a health crisis. The third crisis is, you can label it different things. I like to call it a mental health crisis. I've heard it called a situational adjustment crisis. We just went from a society that was very slow to embrace work from home. Really the only segment of commerce or of industry that embraced work from home was the tech industry. Lots of companies had remote workers, lots of companies had people where they could work from home, but the idea of a fully distributed work from home company was something that relatively few companies at scale do. And the ones that do were almost entirely tech, and the magnitude of those companies were 1,000 people, 1,500 people at most. Suddenly, the entirety of our economy is functioning as work from home. So we have a bunch of these adjustments in how we function against the backdrop of a huge amount of anxiety and fear, on top of now being essentially in our homes with our families, but isolated from other people in a physical sense. None of the natural mental health challenges go away in that. And we've now just added a huge amount of other things. So these three crises fold on each other. And one of the things I think that's really helpful in terms of perspective is that there is no magical endpoint. There isn't this, oh, the crisis, the COVID went away and it's solved and we no longer have to deal with any of these other things. It's very useful to have the frame of reference of these are interdependent crises that are going to be going on for quite some time. So I just start with that because I think there's a lot of people, especially as we get to the end of April, there's a lot of pressure to start to open up our cities, our state, our country. Nobody really knows exactly what that means yet. And there's a lot of speculation, there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of restlessness, but we're still dealing with this disease, and the activity and the sacrifices I think that we've made over the last 3 to 4 weeks in terms of stay at home has given us, certainly in Colorado, the chance to get ahead of it, and most definitely across the United States, the chance to get ahead of it with infrastructure versus where we were even 4 weeks ago, where there was incredible fear that the healthcare infrastructure that we would have would be completely overwhelmed if we didn't slow the spread. And very proud of lots and lots of people for showing leadership there. And I would say for anybody that's listening to this, taking the idea seriously of what you're really doing is actually helping save other people's lives, and you're also helping save your life in the context of the dynamic of what's going on here. So for the people that have really embraced the notion of stay at home and understand the rationale behind the sacrifice that we've all made, thank you.
Brad, do you want
You want to prompt me with the next question, John? What's the next thing on your mind that you'd like me to drive into?
I was like, did I lose you?
I can talk for hours if you'd like me to, but give me a prompt.
You know what? I'm mesmerized, as I said, that I always walk away from a conversation a little smarter. So just the way you frame it, so many of us are living this experience, and just this thought around, this is fundamentally a three-pronged condition that we're dealing with. And so I guess that prompts my other question, which is just in your role playing a lead as a leader in thinking through the recovery. What any vision that you have, any sense that you have of what might unfold as we start to open up again, as economically and just as a society?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, I think it's going to be very confusing the next 30 to 45 days. And I just encourage people to try to have a very flexible mindset around it. The worst thing we could do as a city, as a state, and as a country is open up too fast, have a big incidence of recirculation of the disease, and have to shut down again. And so what we just did with the shutdown was buy ourselves enough time to get organized, to be systematic about all the things that we have to do on a going forward basis to keep everybody safe. The disease is going to continue to circulate. COVID is not, exterminated. The idea that something like, warmer weather will get rid of COVID, nobody knows. The idea that a vaccine will appear magically, nobody knows, and most of the experts believe it's 12 to 18 months away. The idea that drugs will suddenly appear that are helpful as therapies, there's lots of different things in flight, but there is an enormous amount of actual science that needs to be done versus just say, oh, well, this works. And in a lot of ways, the worst, the thing that the scientists are concerned about, it's very valid, it's the way public health has worked for a long time, is you don't want to come up with a solution that actually is worse than the problem. And the idea that you create solutions and rush them, and then a bunch of people die, or a year or two down the road have second order effects, that's a much worse situation than having to be deliberate about what's going on here. So I think frame one is, this is a process that's going to have a lot of bumps in it. And there will be lots of scary and uncomfortable things that happen along the way, because there will be incidents of the disease that spike. We're going to have to change our way of relating with each other in serious ways. If we want to keep and suppress the infection rate. A simple example is masks. If you go on the web and you search for, masks, COVID-19, you'll get 1 billion search results on Google with all kinds of conflicting information and nonsense and whatever. It's pretty clear from the people who have really dug into this that simple face coverings that cover from your nose to your chin are very effective at two things. One is preventing you from spreading the virus if you're infected, because it captures the droplets that you spread. And the other is it prevents you from touching your face, which we do all the time. Probably if you watch the video, whether I'm conscious of it or not, I've probably done it, once a minute or so. And because the virus lives on surfaces for an indeterminate period of time, it can live on surfaces for up to 3 days is the current thinking. As you're out and about and touching things, which we all do, and then you touch your face, that's a way that you get infected. Now, how much does that help if no one wears masks, or 1% of the population masks? The answer is not very much. If 100% of the population wears masks, it's going to have a big impact. And it's going to have a big impact because just those two characteristics are meaningful. But wearing a mask is completely antithetical in a lot of ways to the way that we interact with each other. In the near term, compliance with something like that is incredibly powerful. And modeling that as a leader, as a business person, as somebody, as we start to open back up again, will be very significant. So I think sort of all of these things around social distancing that are coming out that the state recommends, I would take very, very seriously, because they're very well thought out. They're supported with a lot of data. And there's a lot of internal discussion and argument about what needs to be done and at what level, with the idea of minimizing the amount of change. The second thing I would say is, from a business perspective, there's an enormous number of companies that are in distress as a result of this. In the venture world, if your company relies on people traveling or people going to work, even if you had an extraordinary business 2 months ago, you're in pretty a distressed position. If you're a restaurant, if you're any sort of venue-based activity that requires people to show up, many categories of businesses are really in distress. And that has a ripple effect through many other businesses because many companies are service providers to those businesses or they work across the ecosystem of those businesses. There are some companies that benefit from this. Video conferencing is a good example, right? That's a place where there's been a huge short-term rise in focus in terms of behavior. It's probably not that surprising that companies like Netflix are doing extremely well right now, since in the evening our main source of entertainment is to watch Netflix or Amazon. So recognize that it's not evenly distributed across the economy, and it's not evenly distributed across geography. And my encouragement, if you have a business that is not under distress, is to try to really focus on how your business can be a positive force across the ecosystem with your other peer businesses, especially local ones. There's a number of things coming from the private sector that'll start to roll out next week around both supporting and community ideas, information, as well as some functional and financial characteristics that are separate from things like the PPP program. I think there's an enormous amount of effort going in right now to try to mobilize things across the entire state, not just on the Front Range, not just in the major cities, but across all of Colorado at all the different levels, whether it's local business, whether it's entrepreneurial business, whether it's a nonprofit business, whether it's minority or women-led business. Recognize that these things are all interdependent. And so for those of you that are listening that are business people, you're, of course, thinking first and foremost about your own company, but think about how the dynamics of what your own company can do can have a positive impact on other businesses in your ecosystem. If you're a larger company and you have resources, or a company that's doing well, super simple things that you can do that help other companies. One of them, which I think is not talked about enough, is large companies with significant balance sheets accelerating their payables by 15 days, literally just by saying, I have the money, I can pay my bills in 15 days instead of 30 days. Just that has a huge positive downstream impact on lots of small businesses. If you have a business that's a subscription-based business, yeah, you can give discounts in exchange for people paying you now, but a better approach is to try to figure out a way so that they can pay you something now, but you can extend your contract with them in the future. So you're not creating a situation where, by the way, as a customer of a subscription-based business, technology-based business, the idea of, well, I can get a discount in this moment of time, maybe that's good for your business, but it's not good for the other business. So try to figure out a way so it's a positive-sum game versus a zero-sum game where one wins and one loses. The last comment I'd make is, we just had an epic snowstorm. I love epic snowstorms in Boulder. I heard that we're for cities over 50,000 people in the United States, we're the #1 city for snow this year. You got to be #1 at something sometimes, I suppose. The weekends, it's going to be a beautiful weekend. The weather's definitely shifting into that part of the year in Colorado. That's just wonderful. Be conscious of the fact that just because the weather's nice doesn't mean we should ignore all of the things that we've been doing. You can get as crazy as you want to be about it. Well, I need to get out and I need to get some fresh air. Yep, do it, but keep social distancing. Keep paying attention to being safe, because it's not just, again, you that you're taking care of, it's everybody else here. And when somebody says, well, I've already had COVID, so I'm not dangerous anymore, it's not known whether you can be reinfected. It's not known whether just because you've had COVID, you can't be somebody who transports the disease or spreads the disease. And oh, by the way, a lot of people who think they had COVID probably had the flu. And a lot of people who think they had the flu probably had COVID. So there's just not a lot of good understanding of this. So just be conscious of the fact that we're still in the midst of this health crisis. And if we want to get to the positive side of the economic dynamics, we have to continue to mitigate the health crisis, and it's going to go on for a while.
Brad, this is so excellent. practical things that we can all do. I know that you're writing about the face mask has certainly influenced me in terms of saying, yeah, I need to comply too. But just also this notion of building your own business, making sure it's solid, but then thinking how you as a business leader can support the entire economic recovery effort. So, I'll just say this, I know that you yourself have been a leader in that front in terms of both obviously keeping a strong business in our community, but doing what you can to support the effort, both in volunteer support for businesses as they're going through this and helping them manage through the process, but then also just the philanthropy. And I just have to thank both your wife, Amy Batchelor, but you yourself supporting our small business relief fund. And that was just a beautiful contribution in of itself. I thank you so much for your time, Brad. Really means a lot to us. So just to then remind you of a couple things. With respect to the Small Business Relief Fund, the application deadline is Monday, April 20, excuse me. And then from the information standpoint, please remember, we're going to have a great program on April 22nd, Earth Day, the environmental and operational effects of stay at home during COVID-19. Let's live those environmental sustainability values even as we work from home. And then just as I always say to conclude these chamber chats, number one, let's stay healthy. Let's abide by the suggestions from Brad. Stay healthy. Also, stay cool. Listen, we are going to get through this. Absolutely. And we, as a community, we're all in this together. So I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much for joining us on Chamber Chats.
Well done, John.
No, you rock, my friend.
All right.